It's a binary question, and either yes or no. Within Judaism, and I've mentioned this previously, the idea that no, it's not a binary thing. Nobody gets emunah in their pocket. You grow in your emunah. It is a process. As Fromm would call it, it's not having, it's a being. You don't have emunah. It's not like I've got emunah. Maybe having emunah, growing in emunah. But they often talk about it as this, do you believe in God or don't you believe in God? Now, an answer to such a question without being weird about it is a bit of a silly question to ask a kid who's in high school, because what do you mean by God? What aspect of God are you talking about? You have to be more open about the fact that emunah isn't something you're going to get, and if you don't get it, then you're a bad kid. You're one of those kids who don't believe. You're on your way to becoming an atheist. No, Judaism gives space for that growth as a righteous man lives in his emunah. It's not a righteous man has emunah. He is a believer. No, that's not the language we use, in which case, let's sit in that educationally.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. When people talk about emunah, faith, it's often framed as a simple question. Do you believe in God or don't you believe in God? But what if that question misses the point? In this episode, Rabbi Simi Lerner argues that emunah is not a binary yes or no. It's not something a person simply has or lacks. Emunah is something that develops over time, shaped by experience, by thought, and by personal struggle. Together, he and I explore why so many thoughtful people find themselves wrestling with faith, even when they genuinely want to believe. We discuss the difference between a more rational, philosophical approach to Judaism and an approach predicated upon a more Kabbalistic worldview, and whether those approaches are in tension or sometimes can work together. We also examine how the way emunah is often taught may be part of the problem, especially when it's presented in overly simplistic terms that do not reflect the complexity of real life. This is not a conversation about proving that God exists. It's a conversation about what it actually means to live with faith in the modern world, and how a more honest and nuanced understanding of emunah might open the door for people who feel stuck, uncertain, or disconnected. Later in this episode, I asked Simi about his own journey, whether his faith was ever really tested, and how he ended up with the approach that he takes today. That part of the conversation is for paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Originally from Edgware in the United Kingdom, Rabbi Simi Lerner now lives in Beit Shemesh, Israel, with his wife Rivka and their 5 children. He is a lecturer in Jewish philosophy, teaching across Israel and online. He also serves as senior educator at L'Ma'an Achai. Rabbi Lerner hosts the podcast Judaism from Within, co-hosts 2 Rabbis, 3 Opinions, and lectures regularly as part of outreach programs in Tel Aviv. Beyond his educational work, he is a licensed electrician, teaches woodworking, and works part-time as a science teacher at a local primary school. Rabbi Simi Lerner, thank you very much for joining me again on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Simi, you lecture in outreach programs, you teach in schools for young adults who are newly observant, and for that reason, I assume you're familiar with some of the reasons that these young adults became observant, what challenges to faith they may have had in the past, and what challenges to faith they continue to have. So, with that said, in your opinion, when people today say they're struggling with emunah, with faith, what do you think is actually going on beneath the surface?
So it's a bit of a tricky one, because when it comes to a question like this, people immediately assume you should dive into some sort of argumentation, philosophical analysis, or they go to the other extreme where they start speaking about people's psychology and emotional states. And the answer is, unfortunately, like most things, but like I suppose I'll put it in a way that reflects on us as individuals as well. We're all complex, and the same reasons that I believe in God are often reasons why someone else doesn't believe in God. My personal situation comes into play, why I choose to live a religious life, not only my love of truth, but also my family situation, my social situation. So when someone's struggling with emunah, it's not it's psychology or it's philosophy, it's complex. It might be psychological questions, it might be philosophical questions. It also just might mean that they're no longer inspired by it and they just don't find it meaningful right now. The questions and the you can often identify these with the type of question a person's asking. I'll give you a quick anecdote for this. There was a kid. I was in Tel Aviv and I was giving a presentation, a lecture, and one of the kids came up to me, dressed quite colorfully, went straight up to me at the front and went, "Rabbi, my name's Elijah, and I'm an atheist." Now, if someone would have said to me, what is he struggling with? Where's his emunah issue? I'd say, well, he is clearly a searching soul. And it wasn't my cup of tea, what he was searching for, so I introduced him to someone else. But that guy was clearly gagging for something. No one does that unless they are looking to be connected to something. Even though, and if you would have said to another person just on paper, a guy introduced himself as an atheist, someone would say, well, have they read this book? Have they read that book? In this case, it wasn't psychological like I'm being demeaning to him, but he was on a path, a thirst for meaning. So when a person says they're struggling with the moon, what's going on beyond the surface, the same way I could ask, not you, another person, you seem to get up every morning and put on your tefillin. What's going on under the surface there? And it's often as complex.
Well, Simi, let me ask you about Elijah. And I don't mean him per se, but you say he's certainly on a journey. Well, when Richard Dawkins gets up in front of a lecture hall and says, "I'm an atheist," just as Elijah said to you, I don't think most people say he's on a journey searching for meaning. Maybe you would say that. So why do you think Elijah is different, if you do think he's different?
This might sound controversial, but I'm not a controversial individual. But someone like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, take your pick, from Friedrich Nietzsche all the way back to Democritus. These people loved knowledge. They loved the world. They were deeply connected to the world. And unless you're going to, not you, a person will claim that they're being disingenuous, they were on a profound spiritual journey, in my opinion. It took them to a different place than my journey took me. But that doesn't mean they're not on a journey. That doesn't mean they're not being honest. So I do think Richard Dawkins is on a spiritual journey, and it just led him somewhere that differently than mine. That's not being a relativist. I think if I had a conversation with him, not that I could convince him that I'm right, but hopefully a person who's honest, he could give me insight to his perspective and I would gain, and I could give him insight into my perspective and he might respect my perspective more. Not that you have to convince a person to have truth there. I think conversations are possible between genuine seekers, I suppose. And the word seeker often means like seeker, like a mystical. No, I mean a seeker in the sense that they are striving for meaning in this world in an honest way.
That's a very fair answer. Now, I'm going to jump into something controversial, but I've been very open about my feelings about this. Very famously, Rabbi Wasserman, that's Hashem avenged his blood, killed by the Nazis. He wrote that faith is so obvious. Faith in Torah, belief in Torah is so obviously true that anybody who is not religious, the only reason that can be so must be because they have an ulterior motive to ignore what is obviously true. And I find that position profoundly troubling because it essentially dismisses anyone who has religious doubts as being a seeker after physical pleasure. That's essentially how it comes across to me, whether or not that's a fair description of or summary of Rav Elchanan's position. So I have always been careful to stay far away from that, even though I've heard it mentioned again and again, even to the present day. And I'd like to get your take on that particular idea.
So I think it's in Kovetz Shurim, where he discusses I think his point is more, if the Torah expects something of us and it's so easily accessible, because a true, you read that, so I think the parallel he brings is someone like Aristotle could believe in God, and the argumentation that you can find to the truth of such a proposition is so open and so clearly true. And I'm not sure if he brings a specific argument. It might be the teleological argument, just the obviousness of the world around us, that God is clearly part of this world and part of your lives. And to dismiss this, there must be another reason. It's almost, I'm so convinced of this. If you're not convinced of this, then you're a problem. So That's explaining disbelief. That's what he's doing. Because if you think about it, that's a real problem. How can you have non-believers? Why would God allow such a position to exist? And it's a really troubling issue for certain religious thinkers. And his solution is it's a moral issue. It's a moral issue that needs to be dealt with. I think Rabbi Tzadok in Sitkas Hasadik basically says it's an issue with a person's soul. The reaction to disbelief is troubling for people who find it so obvious. There's not really a way of me answering such a claim, except that doesn't mirror my experience. A similar thing came about, which I found troubling as well. Now, I don't mean to badmouth this book. It's perhaps a wonderful book, and I read it many years ago. It's a book called Off the Derech. And I read this many years ago, and unfortunately, like most things, the part that you don't like sticks out to you. So it's probably a wonderful book. One point that I believe she makes in this book is that a person shouldn't get involved in kiruv or outreach unless they are certain of their position, because your insecurity, your doubt will seep over in your teachings. I couldn't disagree more with that, because I think doubt and honesty and an appreciation for the world we live in, and that things aren't certain and things are complex, doesn't stand in the way of true commitment, but it's part of life. And if you're not honest about that, you might convince, and I think the word convince is best, because convince is a psychological term. You might convince people you're right. You might even convince people to change their way of life. But convincing people isn't honest. You're not there to convince people when you're involved in outreach. You're there to display a worldview. And if your worldview involves doubt, involves complexity, involves difficulty, involves religious struggle, you should be open about that. So when it comes to this point of Rav Chana, I hear it a lot. And the only thing I can answer is I can put my hands up and say, that's not my experience.
Completely fair and reasonable. And what you just quoted, that idea that you're saying, in contrast to what you read in Off the Derech, definitely reminds me of what I've heard from Rav Sachs, who said something along the lines of faith is the courage to live with uncertainty. That's a very different kind of experience than the one you described right there. But now that we've spoken about several attitudes and approaches towards building emunah, kiruv, call it what you will, in ways that are not necessarily, in your experience, healthy or my experience, healthy, do you think that the way that it's commonly taught in the Orthodox world today, I'm speaking of emunah, is hurting the struggle or helping the struggle that people often have?
So this is once again an interesting question, a question of education. And I was reflecting on this. How would I have preferred it to be taught when I was a kid? Now, everybody's got their horror stories, and everybody's got their moments of struggle, and everybody's got the point where they realize something wasn't true, and they realize that they were being lied to, or there's all different stories. And I think the temptation to say we should start teaching Kant or Aristotle in high school, I don't think is the right answer. I think the concept of emunah, both in terms of how we experience it and how we talk about it, could be refined at an earlier stage. What I mean by that is that when we talk about emunah, sometimes people talk about it as a binary thing, a bit like Catholicism or Christianity. Do you believe in Jesus or don't you believe in Jesus? It's a binary question, and either yes or no. Within Judaism, and I've mentioned this previously, the idea that no, it's not a binary thing. Nobody gets emunah in their pocket. You grow in your emunah. It is a process. As Fromm would call it, it's not having, it's a being. You don't have emunah. It's not like I've got emunah. Maybe having emunah, growing in emunah. And the reason why I say sociologically this is actually how we talk about it is you've never seen a book on the Manny's shelf from Feldheim on get your emunah here. It's always grow in emunah. And we're so good with that. But this is where you get some sort of performative contradiction on the level of educators. But they often talk about it as this, do you believe in God or don't you believe in God? Now, an answer to such a question without being weird about it is a bit of a silly question to ask a kid who's in high school, because what do you mean by God? What aspect of God are you talking about? If you believe in God purely by the target of a first cause, well, from a Jewish standpoint, that's not particularly interesting. You mean believe in God a lot more than that, and a lot less than that. So you have to be more open about the fact that emunah isn't something that you're going to get, and if you don't get it, then you're a bad kid. You're one of those kids who don't believe. You're on your way to becoming an atheist. No, Judaism gives space for that growth as a righteous man lives in his emunah. It's not a righteous man has emunah. He is a believer. No, that's not the language we use, in which case, let's sit in that educationally.
That leads us directly to our larger topic for today, which involves rationalism, mysticism, and the like. And even though this isn't our primary topic today, what you're saying now, Simi, seems to fly in the face of what the Rambam meant when he talked about faith and emunah. I'm not saying it does, but certainly in the formulation that many people say after davening in the morning, I believe with perfect faith in the following 13 propositions, that doesn't sound like anything other than a binary. Do you believe it or don't you believe it? You're stating you believe in it.
So that's a great point. And when it comes to the Rambam, things are obviously tricky, based both from the academic and point of view of scholarship, but also in terms of how we engage with the Rambam today. Like just to give our listeners some inkling of how the Rambam discusses it in the Shemona Prakim, then how he discusses it in the Mishnah Torah, and how he doesn't discuss it to the same extent when it comes to the Moira. These things are important to understand what the Rambam meant. But let's actually sidestep the Rambam for a minute. The value of the Rambam doesn't only come from his Yud Gimel Ikarim, it comes from his methodology, how he approached things, how he thought that you were supposed to engage in the world in a way that treated the world as really real, and thereby your rationale, your reason, your logical deduction, your experience had a real part to play. So how would I deal with such a question? Now, obviously, I can tell you, a person says, well, I believe in God 100%. I'd say, look, I don't know what you mean by that. I can use my experience to answer the person, but I don't even have to do that. I could go to the Rishonim. Once again, this is the value of studying the Rishonim. The Chaskei Kreskas, the Rebbe of Rabbi Yosef Albo, made a very clear question, and people often find this like a great question to ask someone. It's like, what's the first commandment in the Torah? And Seres Dibros, I'm Hashem your God, believe in God. Now, what's wrong with commanding you to believe in God? And everybody stops for a minute, and they stop, and they're like, to believe in God. Well, if you acknowledge a commander, I don't need to command you anymore. Belief in God cannot be commanded because where's it coming from? If it's coming from a commander, then you've got the commander already. And if you don't believe in a commander, me yelling at you to believe in it isn't within your free will to accept. So that's a problem. So what do you do with that? The Abarbanel gives a great suggestion. It's a person who's working on it. If you think the world, if you want to live your life in this direction, this is another question that comes about since post-Immanuel Kant, where the classical arguments for the existence of God were defanged in a way that they became less convincing. What's the point of that? And I tell my students, there's a profound point behind them. There's a big difference between a person who is working, discussing, thinking about transcendent issues, necessity, causation. They're engaging their mind in the world of greater things. From the Abarbanel standpoint, that's a kiyum in believing in God. Not because you can get it in a binary sense. Now, I'm not saying he would agree with this completely, but that's how I would use the Abarbanel to explain my position today.
You know, what you're saying now also reminds me of what Rav Soloveitchik said, I believe in Uvikashtem Misham, where he said that Kant has shown that proofs for God's existence don't really work on a purely intellectual level. However, their place still exists in that they demonstrate a longing for God. So whereas Kant removed the intellectual power of those arguments, the fact that people still use them demonstrate a longing for God, which has religious value, and in some ways demonstrates a reaching out for God too.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that.
So that brings us to the topic of mysticism, experiential Judaism. I don't know if they're the same thing, but I'd like to talk about that. Because you've suggested that today, in our Judaism today, in the Orthodox world, there's been a shift towards a more mystical or experiential type of language. What does that look like in practice in your mind?
So I think I draw a distinction between, maybe I'll lay it out this way. When it comes to experiential Judaism, I think that encompasses both a person who's involving himself in the early Rishonim, as well as the mystics of today and of the 15th century. The idea that mysticism, reason, and experience are completely separate identities, I don't think that's the case. I think when it comes down to what the point that I think comes about when we talk about religious experience and we talk about mysticism becoming more and more popular, is that the way people speak about the world and the way people speak about emunah, the way people speak about bitachon, the way people speak about hashgacha are heavily influenced by a more esoteric side of our tradition. Now, does that mean there's more experience there? Not necessarily. A person can just look at the world as saying, well, this is the map that I've got of reality. It is more mystically influenced. And when I say mystically influenced, I mean Kabbalistically influenced. And a person who takes a more rationalistic approach to the world, and the reason why these terms are tricky is because it doesn't mean a Kabbalist isn't rational. Of course a Kabbalist is rational. He has a set of propositions and he moves around with them. But a person who is more influenced by that side of the tradition, they will have certain experiences. And a person who's influenced by the tradition that's primarily associated with the Rishonim, they are also going to have an experience. It will be a different type of experience, but it's no less of an experience. why today is one more prominent than the other, or why does our educational system shift more towards one over the other? I think that's got to do with I suppose, ease of it being given over. Historically, one became more prominent. There are different thinkers that give different suggestions why one took hold, and I suppose they're speculative, but I think both of them will have profound religious experiences, which is why, and interestingly enough, there are many people who would consider Maimonides a mystic. And people are like, wait a minute, doesn't he reject mysticism? Well, he doesn't reject mysticism, but he very clearly had a very rich understanding of the cosmos in a way that we would find so profoundly bizarre. In a funny way, when people talk about rationality and the rationalist tradition, sometimes they unknowingly shift that for like logical positivism, that somehow the Rambam was a scientist in the way we understand scientists today. He most certainly was not. He had a ladder of being. He was very much influenced by, well, obviously Aristotle, but also the Neoplatonists. There's this ladder of being, the active intellect, which I have to transcend to reach the Almighty. We'd look at that as go, why is that not a Kabbalistic framework? It's very different than the Kabbalists, because he thought that was nature. He thought he was being a scientist by looking at the world through those lenses. He wasn't getting it from anywhere else. So it's one of those things that these terms can be fuzzy and they can shift over, and you can offend people by saying, I don't know, a Kabbalist isn't rational. God forbid, of course they are. Yeah, so I suppose the terminologies need to be really defined.
Okay, let's define our terminology. At least when you speak about rationalism in the sense that you mean it, what do you mean by that?
I mean when you feel that you're profoundly in touch with the world. The world isn't something to see through to a spiritual reality. The world is really real, like really, really real, in the sense that God created this world and you're directly in touch with the world God created, which means your reason, your rationale, the nations of the world and their wisdom have a central role to play in how you understand the world. The world came before the Torah. Like, take that. We look at the world as being a revelation of God, as much as the Torah, in a way more so, because what came first? Now, I know people will say, but isn't the Torah before the universe? Right. Whatever you mean by that, it isn't the book in front of us right now. You might mean some sort of meaning that God wanted in parts of it. Whatever you mean by that, you don't mean the book. In which case, from my standpoint, the world comes to me first, and then I have the Torah. And these are both revelations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they are both really real. And looking at through the world through the lens of both the Rishonim and later thinkers such as Reb Soloveitchik, Rav Kook even, Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, mirror my experience. I feel my experience is validated, which means I am in tune with the world. I am an agent in the world. I have a system, which I call the Torah, and I have the world in front of me, and I feel a profound connection between the two of them, what they call a worldview attunement. I am attuned to that world. And when I hear a sort of, say, an esoteric side of the tradition, this comes in its positive and its more dangerous negative expressions, depending on who's teaching it and who's giving it over, either it being a heavy immanence that's expressed in the realm of hashgacha pratis, or a sort of what Rav Hirsch called theosophic dream worlds, where you've got this lattice of energies and spiritual beings and all these sort of things. I don't find that spiritually meaningful. So there is an area within the tradition that validates this worldview, in which case I sit in with that. That isn't, God forbid, to say the other one is wrong. I'm not omniscient, but I can tell you which one I find more attractive and which I find connects me to the world in a real way.
That's very interesting. So are you saying that I'll call it Kabbalistic rather than mystical in order to narrow it down. Would you say largely that the Kabbalistic approach reverses that order? Because what really stood out to me was when you said in your definition of a rationalist approach, the world comes first and the Torah follows it and applies to that world. And even though, yes, we have the phrase, Kushabrichu, Yistakal Boraitu Bari Alma, God looked into the Torah and created the world. You say, yes, true, but that might be referring to something else, some primordial type of thing, not the book in front of us right now. Would you say, therefore, that the mystical approach or the Kabbalistic approach would say, no, that is actually what happened. The Torah, as we see it now, came first, and then the world emerged from that, and that really defines ultimately the difference. Is that what you're saying?
To some extent, but I just want to give a caveat, and then I'll lean into the point you're making. Rabbi Yerucham, famous voice for the yeshiva world, and has some unbelievably beautiful works. And he speaks about the importance of the different levels of the mystics, the Asiya, Bria, and he speaks about how this world in some way is, meaning he's using a Kabbalistic model, but he's saying, one, they aren't separate worlds. They are different in terms of what they are here to do, how far or close they are to God. And in some way, the world we're experiencing now is more important because it's concrete, but it also reflects these higher worlds, which means a person obviously can approach the Kabbalistic tradition through different lenses. What I'm describing here is probably the one that I've been in touch with most, and in the yeshivish world, the one that people articulate most. And simply speaking, and this probably comes more from the Maharal, but the idea that, yes, the world is a reflection of the Torah, which the idea where you get that words are a reflection of the things, and the idea that a object, how it's written in the Torah, has to emerge in the world in this way. So much so that you have, like, I don't know, God's hand in the Torah. They don't want to say that that's sort of some sort of description of something God's doing in this world. No, they're saying, no, God has the real hand, and we are a pale comparison of God's hand. And that sort of language, now, as I said, it's not, I can't say it's not, God forbid, am I question its authenticity. It's part of the Jewish tradition, but it isn't part of the Jewish tradition that every single person has to adopt. There are many different angles to look at. So, for example, someone like Rav Hirsch wouldn't engage in that conversation. He'd think the entire conversation is slightly meaningless. Like, what do you mean by God's hand? Like, you've lost me at that point. Now, could that be a reflection of his philosophical worldview? Yes, but the same way the Maharal was dealing with his philosophical worldview. He was still swimming in the culture he was swimming in, which is why he would use Aristotelian concepts. So I'm saying that when it comes down to our understanding of the world and our ability to connect to the world, and when we say Kabbalist today, we primarily do mean that idea that the world comes first, the Torah comes first, and the world emerges from that. So when there's, and this affects understandings of Hashgacha, understandings of B'tochen, and other things like that. Does that answer the question? Or
yes, very much so. I really appreciate that. I think it's fascinating, and my thoughts are flying around trying to organize them so that I can express them coherently. Part of what you're saying now also, to me, is very important, simply because I have discovered and noticed a movement among many people, well-meaning people, to narrow Judaism, to narrow Torah down to something very, very specific, and say anything outside of this very narrow vision of what Hashkafa is, of what our understanding of Torah is essentially not Torah. As opposed to what you're saying, which is that there could be different approaches. What I certainly agree with, this idea of Shivim Panim La Torah, there are 70 or call it 600,000 facets to the Torah, and every individual has to find the facet that speaks to him or her. I don't want to expand what you're saying more than you want to expand, but I'm saying how I relate to that. And for example, one comment which I've spoken to many people about is, for example, Rav Rabinovich Zatzal, his attitude towards slavery. I know I'm taking this a little bit far afield right now. And Rav Rabinovich and others have said that when the Torah permits slavery, it is doing so with the ultimate goal of removing slavery, acknowledging that at the time the Torah was given, the idea of an economy without slavery was simply unthinkable. Whether morally that's okay or not is not the point. It was unthinkable. And therefore, the Torah allowed slavery in a very specific, constrained manner with the ultimate goal of getting rid of slavery. They say the Torah is an anti-slavery document, as evidenced by Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, and the goal was to get rid of slavery. Some people, more than one, have approached me and say, I don't know how Rav Rabinovich says this, but that's kfira, that's apikorsis, that's not acceptable. How can you say that something in the Torah is not perfect? That the Torah said something which was time-bound? And essentially, I think that example expresses, I think, and you can tell me if you agree, very much with what you're saying. Because if the Torah comes first, then they're right. If the Torah comes second, then they're wrong.
Yeah, no, so that's a very good point. I'll give you another example just before I attempt to tackle it. For example, Reb Joshua Berman, in his work Ani Mamim and his new Haggadah, which is very beautiful.
He was on this podcast a month ago.
Nice. So his approach to understanding the Mishkan, understanding the language of the Torah, is very much historically contextualized, in the sense that the Torah is speaking to the people on the ground, meaning the Torah is actually speaking to the Jews on the ground. Now, some people find that profoundly uncomfortable, because it implies that the perfection of the Torah is somehow tampered with, because they have in mind something, and it's very difficult for me to give to completely steel man a view that I don't necessarily appreciate, but they look at the Torah as being this sort of on white fire and black fire, this thing that is not in any way historically touched. It's just pure truth. Now, obviously, philosophically, that doesn't make much sense the way I just phrased it, but I'm sure they could phrase it better. But absolutely, the idea being that if the Torah is not perfect, or the Torah is historically contextualized, that implies lack of perfection. Rabbi Rabinovich, or I think Rabbi Sachs uses this as well when he speaks about it, he would say, no, that's an expression of its perfection, meaning it is perfect because it does this. So from an educational standpoint, which is where my interest often lies, I mean, my personal view is not central in this case, meaning when it comes down to it, when you teach, what do you do? And the way I teach is that I give my students all the opinions. I give them a whole bunch of opinions, and a person says, well, which one's true? You're kind of asking the wrong question, because none of us are omniscient. It's the type of thing when it comes down to, think of another example, the age of the universe. Now, you can go and say the Torah wasn't talking about the universe in a scientific way, so it's a silly question. Yes, 7 days. Well, the Torah wasn't talking like that. It's like you're taking a scientific method that was invented. Now, people say invented. Yeah, no, the scientific method came about. It was something that we had to discover, if you will. And you're applying that to a text that was written to slaves 3,000. What are you talking about? What a silly question. Another person would say, well, days, what does days mean? And they would try and do it, or a person would say that no, Hashem made it looking old. And there's 20 different approaches. And guess what? A student will have to find his way within that mess. Now, obviously, this is dangerous. A mess in a pejorative way, but a mess in terms of there's a lot of opinions, and can they all sit together? Maybe, and which is why you get some people who try to unify all the opinions. But there is obviously a danger to this, because then, wait a minute, then maybe I'm just shopping around for my Judaism. And the answer to that question is, to an extent, yes. But even the person who wants to go white fire, black fire, they're also doing that. Meaning there's something about that way of looking at the world that appeals to them. In which case, what justifies them taking that approach? Which means we can't escape our personalities and what we want. We just have to do our best to be honest. Now, is there a certain Overton window? Yes, I think there is. I mean, a person can't draw out a Reform rabbi and give it within orthodoxy and say, well, this is a great opinion. It might be a lovely opinion academically, but from an orthodox standpoint, it's beyond the pale. He's not sharing our assumptions, in which case his approach isn't relevant. When it comes down to people who are clearly part of the tradition and they give approaches, nobody's asking you to shecht your cow differently. Talking about your mind. When it comes to hashkafa, how do you approach this within your mind? And there are many different opinions.
What you're saying now reflects my own experience in talking to my kids over the years. And often they would say, hey, Abba, how do you explain whatever the issue was? And I would say, well, the Nefesh Chaim says this, the Baal Tanya says this, or say, what do you think? Say, what do I think? And I would have a hard time. That was the part where I would say, I like having all the opinions in front of me. I don't know. And that's not necessarily easy for a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old to digest. The idea that lahagdil Torah ulahadira means having many different options in front of us and not necessarily knowing which is right or saying they all have truth in them is something which is more easy for perhaps an adult to accept, maybe, than a child. At least that's been my own experience.
So it's interesting. There was I was giving a lecture in Tel Aviv on Hashgacha, and with the sources, going through the ideas, and these are complete beginners. And one of the principles we have when we teach is that we don't water down the ideas. We explain them differently in terms of we try and make them accessible. We don't water them down. And I was giving the approach to Hashgacha Pratis and Hashgacha Klalis from two distinct angles. I was explaining it from the point of view of Harambam and from the Hasidic world. Now, obviously, that's a broad category, but I sort of lumped most Hasidic approaches into one sort of very immanent approach of how God is involved in your life in a very personal way and how that's taken today. And I expressed both of them, and I did my best to express them both in a very emotionally driven way, as if like the world is beautiful through this lens. And a student came up to me afterwards and said, well, which one do you believe? And I really thought that was such a compliment because it meant I gave them over both. And I said, if we're going to look at the world through this binary, definitely Maimonides. And she was absolutely shocked. She was like, why would you even be religious then? Like, if you look at that HaKadosh Baruch Hu as having a certain distance from you, unless you're righteous and there's closeness and there's distance. And then literally 2 kids who were waiting afterwards came up to me and said, Rabbi, I never heard Judaism articulated like that. He said, I've been an atheist my whole life, and I've been recently looking to connect with my tradition and find deeper meaning to my life, but nothing about religion struck me as being allowed me to keep my hat of reason at the door. And what you just said now, I'd love to study that more. And so in which case, which one's true? The answer is, until we're dead, we won't know. But what is definitely true is there were 2, and I'll use spiritual language, there were clearly 2 different neshamas in front of me. One was called to one and one was called to the other. The one who was called to the Hasidic approach, could I psychoanalyze and explain why they need that crutch? Maybe. Could I do exactly the same to the one who was who found the Maimonidean approach far more enlightening and attractive? I could also psychoanalyze him and call it a crutch as well. So you can always do psychology, but you've got to trust people to go on their journey.
I want to come back later to how this plays out in your own life, because theory is one thing, but how a person actually gets there is something else. Let's expand that a little bit more, Simi. So you talked about that second person who found the philosophical approach so compelling. But as you said, a lot of people would say, how can you even be religious and feel that God is, quote unquote, distant, to use your term? He's not involved in everything that you do. What does the philosophical approach add in a religious viewpoint, in Hashkafat Olam, that the mystical approach wouldn't have, that would be important for people to know who may not know about that approach?
So it's worth saying that so the Rambam has an approach to Hashgacha. The Ralbag has an approach to Hashgacha. Rabbi Yosef Albo has an approach to Hashgacha. There are very many approaches to how we understand God's involvement in this world, because everybody agrees that God is involved in this world. We have the Torah. Now, they all accept the Torah as being foundational, in which case, how do you deal with that? Why is Maimonides just not saying, no, God is like your brother. He's like sitting on your lap, you're sitting on his lap, and he's with you the whole time, and everything in front of you, which is, I suppose, one approach, everything in front of you is completely orchestrated by God for you personally. The reason he doesn't want to say that is because he has philosophical commitments where that will become problematic. Now, it's worth pointing out, someone like, as I said, Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Hirsch, are they also sitting within a... Soloveitchik I'm not that familiar with to the extent I am with Rav Hirsch. He's sitting within a rationalist tradition, but he's approaching things very differently, meaning he's not using a Kabbalistic framework to explain his Judaism, but he's still using what we would call, within the context of this discussion, from the rationalistic way of looking at the world and not appealing to mystical entities. So what would be beneficial of looking at the world through the Rambam standpoint? Well, there's a number of different things. First of all, it mirrors my experience. Everything is decided on Rosh Hashanah, which we have a Gemara in Beitza that describes everything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. And a person says, what are you talking about, Simi? God is involved in your life in a profoundly intimate way the whole time. Yeah, but that's not my experience. There are moments in my life, perhaps, where I feel God as being part of my life. There are moments in history where I can see God's involvement in the world. But in general, I understand statistics. I understand the way the world works. And to say to me that it just doesn't mirror my experience. And then when I find that Maimonides says that actually, that's not the way the world is. God isn't intimately involved in your life to the extent he is with Moshe Rabbeinu. It's like one person may say, well, that's a bit distancing. Maimonides isn't saying God is absent from the world. He's just saying he's not involved in your life to the extent he is with Moshe Rabbeinu. That Hashgacha Pratis isn't present with you. And that can be validating because that mirrors my worldview. It mirrors how I experience the world. It doesn't ask me to pretend for a certain amount of time that a world that I don't see. And once again, this might be a personality thing. Some people absolutely love this approach and are horrified when people say, even the Ralbag, where he describes that God doesn't actually know you personally. People are shocked how a religious thinker could say that. But it wasn't his dormant atheism that came up with that. It was his love of God and love of truth that brought him to say such a thing. Another angle, which I think is also very important, on an emotional level. If God is intimately involved with everybody the same way, then he's not intimately involved with anybody. What I mean by that is, imagine I tell you, I love your children as much as I love my children. Well, that's not the way of saying I don't really love your children or my children. No, I love my children way more than I love your children, and I would hope so. And God is connected, if you will, to people who are connected to him. That is once again, it mirrors my experience of relationships. It's not this idea that God loves me unconditionally and all this sort of language, which, by the way, there's space for that. And if that works for you, that is great. But if you have this idea, and it doesn't mean God doesn't love you, because within Harambam's standpoint, that would also be tricky to talk a bit like that. But moving that to one side, just talking about from the point of view of my experience, that speaks to people. It mirrors their experience.
And very much what you're saying now, if I can say lahavdil, but C.S. Lewis mentions that, in his opinion, the doors or the gates to hell are locked from the inside. And that's kind of what you're saying. Essentially, as much as I approach God, God will approach me. And if I don't approach God, it's not because God hates me. It's because I didn't make that approach myself. And I think on some level, you're reflecting that right now in describing the Rambam's viewpoint that way.
Interesting. Yeah.
Now, I want to take it further from what you said. And by the way, I will echo what you said about the different approaches, although for me, the Ralbag is essentially incomprehensible. I can't understand personally how anybody can be a Gersonides follower in 2026 when his assumptions about the way the world works scientifically and philosophically are not accepted by almost anybody anymore because his Aristotelian viewpoint is simply no longer the common way of looking at the world. So to believe like the Ralbag to me today is inconceivable, but I guess that's okay if some people can do it.
By the way, can I just give a little angle for the audience to think about? Creation of the world, something that we take as so obvious. From a monotheistic standpoint, is that good or bad? People say, oh, it's good. Hashem created the world. But does that not mean God changed? And change isn't good from a monotheistic standpoint. What caused God to create the world where previously he hadn't created the world? And just such a simple question that when I was in my first journey when I was younger of learning Jewish philosophical thought, that hit me as well, that's a good point. That doesn't mean the Rambam doesn't believe that God created the world, and it doesn't mean, but it does make you think about monotheism in a different way. If God knows about me today and me tomorrow, those are two different things. How does God know particulars? Particulars change. Particulars aren't necessary. Categories are necessary. So it's one of those things that emotionally I find that very distancing. I would take a very different approach. But the idea of that being comprehensible, it does. So that's the philosophical backing for such an approach.
Right. And I would counter that with saying that the biggest problem, I'd say, with the Rambam's philosophy is not the specifics, but the assumption that our philosophy can define God. And therefore, God has to fit into my philosophical categories. Admittedly, I'm coming from a post-Kantian approach. So therefore, yes. I understand already things that he couldn't have understood because they didn't exist yet. I want to get back to something you said earlier about methodology. Because in talking about the Rambam, we've been using the Rambam as if his particular approach right now is one that can speak to people. And that's certainly true for a lot of people. And yet, when we think about the rationalism of Maimonides, his answers per se are very different from his attitude, meaning the answers he gave are often, perhaps for some people, not relevant, or perhaps already obvious, as opposed to his methodology, which can still be more relevant even if you don't necessarily like his answers. Let me give an example. A very large percentage of the Moreh Nevuchim is dedicated towards demonstrating that various verses that imply corporeality in God or in the spiritual worlds are not to be taken literally. And that's true. We all accept that nowadays. But it's obvious the Rambam was so successful that we don't even need to talk about this anymore. He was so successful that we don't even understand the question. Of course that's true. Or other things that he says are based on certain assumptions about Aristotle's worldview, about the creation of the world. So whether or not we agree with his understanding of the creation of the world, the assumptions he's working with are not really assumptions that anyone today has. So my question for you is, when we look at the Rambam, if we look at his answers, we'll often say his answers are simply not relevant to us nowadays because he was speaking to people hundreds of years ago who believed in a different, quote unquote, scientific universe than we do. But his attitude, his methodology, the fact that he's willing to engage with that world, as you say, take the world as it is. The world really, really exists. That's what I take from the Rambam. Which side would you say? What's the most important thing to take from the Rambam?
So from my standpoint, it would very much be on the level of methodology. That doesn't mean his ideas and his concepts aren't profoundly valuable. But you are correct when he says, for example, what I understand as an angel and Aristotle understands as an angel is the same thing. Now, that's beautiful because it refers to an angel basically as a force of nature to an extent. And I find that really inspiring. Now, can I detach that from how he understands? I can detach that from Aristotelianism because that mirrors what the Rambam thought an angel was. So if I can hold on to the Rambam's understanding and detach it from his Aristotelian framework, then that's great. But there's certain things I probably can't. But also remember, the same way the Rambam was committed was looking at the world through an Aristotelian lens. In today's day and age, we look at the world through different philosophical lenses, and thereby, in 50 years' time, someone may say the same thing about us, but guess what? That's life, and that's part of the journey. And that's part of the reason why I say that if your conception of God hasn't changed in your journey as a Jew, then there's a problem. Your conception, understanding of God should constantly change because you should constantly be learning. You'll see a different thinker, you'll see a different approach, and it'll talk to you in a way that it didn't. Which is, by the way, why I say that, like, I don't know later on in my life whether I'll be attracted to a Kabbalistic framework. I can say I won't be. Okay, right now I'm not. I find it aesthetic, but I don't find it meaningful. That doesn't mean I won't one day. So when it comes to Rambam, the Rambam very much gives us a methodology of approaching the world and approaching a commitment to reason and things making sense. I'll give you a good example of this. When he speaks about, I believe it's in the second part of the guide, he talks about a mental disease people have. The more unintelligible it is, somehow the better it is. I think that's still true today. You give me an idea that doesn't make sense and say to me, it's like when I was in yeshiva, there was a shir that people used to go to, and we're like, it was almost a compliment to say that no one understood what he was talking about, as if that was a compliment. And I was like, well, that just means no one understands what he's talking about. And he could be the biggest genius in the world, but that's not particularly useful. So when it comes to the Rambam, at least personally, when I learn the guide, when I learn, at least from the philosophical standpoint, it's his methodology where I can grab it, and the conclusions where I can as well.
Okay, then let's move from the Rambam on to Rav Hirsch. And I know that you are a Hirschian. You are somebody who highly respects and I think lives by many of the ideas espoused by Rav Shlomo Raphael Hirsch. I'd like to know what that means to you, because in speaking about the Rambam, we're talking about somebody who lived close to 1,000 years ago. But when speaking about Rav Hirsch, We're speaking about somebody who lived much more recently, much closer to our own time, admittedly still 150 years ago, but he espoused a type of rationalism that was appropriate for the world in which he lived in Germany in the 19th century, yet it's close enough to our world that we can gain a huge amount by reading it, even if it isn't identical to our intellectual universe. So can you tell me a little bit about why you find Rav Hirsch so compelling?
So it's interesting just because we're paralleling Harambam in the context of Aristotle. People in the Hirschian world, people get very bent out of shape when anyone accuses Rav Hirsch of being influenced by Schiller, or Hegel, Kant, as if like Chas v'Shalom, he was approaching Judaism from within himself, sich selbst begreifendes Judentum. Now, I think that uncomfortableness is a little bit silly at times because you can't escape the world you're in the same way no one can. I suppose in the Kabbalistic tradition they try to, but they can't. No one can. You can't escape the world, the water you're swimming in. And Rav Hirsch is working with the best ideas that he found within his world to understand Judaism and understand the world. So I think that this fact that Rav Hirsch was using the world, not influenced. Influence has like a negative sound to it. He was using the world and its wisdom to the best of his ability. So how does that look in practice? Well, it looks at the world through the lens of the Torah. It understands it's not to say that other people don't, obviously, but it looks at the world as being a landscape of meaning, of connection, of mission, of process, of understanding the world and our position in the world, uses the language of mission in terms of our relationship with the world and with God. It uses the language of symbolism to extract meaning from the world. If you want a metaphor, perhaps, the mystic might look at the world, the Kabbalist might look at the world as being brimming with the song of God, and you're here to listen to that song. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean a Kabbalistic approach is completely passive, but there's a certain passivity to it. I see things appear before me that God is instructing, rather than perhaps someone like Rav Hirsch, where he looks at the world as being a score that has been written by the Almighty, and we're here to read it. We take the mitzvahs in the Torah and we use it to reveal the meaning in the world. Now, a person can say, well, where's God in this picture? Yeah, God's always present. God is akin to a personality that is present with you in this journey. It's like God's absent from you. So that is, I suppose you could say, without getting into the nitty-gritty, how I look at the world from Rav Hirsch's standpoint.
I believe that his grandson, at least I was told this, I don't know if it's true, Rav Yitzchak Breuer, that style, had a picture of Kant on his wall. I was told that.
Yeah, so, he said you say a bracha when you learn Kant. He had a picture of, now he had a picture of Rav Hirsch and he had a picture of Immanuel Kant, because from his standpoint, not in the area of ethics, but not in terms of his approach to autonomy, but in terms of his approach to epistemology, to say that Rav Hirsch wasn't influenced by that is, once again, the minute you use the word influence, it means almost there was this a view from nowhere where the Torah stands in isolation and immune from the world it's in, and you could look at that Torah, or you can look at a Torah that's influenced. Like the Kabbalistic world, it's not the Kabbalistic worldview also has its influences, but that's once again unnecessarily negative. It's like, no, the Kabbalistic world emerged at a point in history, and the language of a point of it, the Kabbalistic worldview, let's say the revelation of the Zohar in the 1400s, let's say it would have happened now. I mean, revelation is a tricky word, but let's say the Kabbalistic revolution happened now. Would they use biological metaphors? Would they be used only Neoplatonic metaphors of emanations? Maybe they would have used other language. Maybe Rav Moshe DeLeon, maybe the Arizal would have said, wow, we've got this concept called engineering. My gosh, do I find awesome metaphors to describe spiritual realities and profound spiritual concepts with the language of diodes and logic gates. I don't know. Everyone's influenced by their world, or better put, everybody is living in the world, and you can't not live in the world.
I certainly agree with what you're saying. And I think that even now in the realms of computer science, understanding what does the omnipresence of God mean, the fact that he's everywhere, and understanding a program existing within a computer, again, as a metaphor that is conditioned by our time and space, doesn't mean we have to accept it, but it gives us additional ways of perhaps relating to something which could otherwise be difficult. If we understand a computer program as existing within the computer, and yet it exists kind of independently and does what it does, and yet where is the computer from the perspective of that program? The answer is, it's everywhere. Well, where is it? It's everywhere. It gives us a nice metaphor. By the way, Aryeh Kaplan said this long before I did. Nice. But it gives a nice metaphor for understanding how God can be everywhere and, quote unquote, nowhere at the same time.
So I use something very similar when it comes to the personality of God, something that Rav Hirsch was very adamant on. And I think there's a thinker from the UK called Rabbi Isidore Epstein that philosophically argues for the personality of God. And a person would say, why do you have to argue philosophically? That's the realm of philosophy in this context. It's where you feel you have to not assert things at me. X exists. God does this. No, you have to argue for it. Otherwise, it doesn't have the teeth anymore. You have to argue for it philosophically and wait to see if people find your arguments compelling. And see, he does so. But from Rav Hirsch's standpoint, the metaphor I use, because he critiques the Rambam in this context, is if you spend so much time focusing on a truth, perhaps, that God isn't a person, God isn't a daddy in the sky, but you spend too much time focusing in on that, you lose God in the process. God becomes a force of nature that doesn't care about you. And this is one of the dangers of learning the guide often, is that people can get so enamored with concepts that they lose the God that the Rambam is trying to give us. So I use a bit of a metaphor. The Torah describes himself as God as personality, something akin to a personality clearly. Is that true? Well, in a similar way when it comes to computers. When I'm on my computer right now and I'm playing around with windows, is the computer a window? No, clearly not. But I'm moving them. It's like, well, it is true, but there is a deeper level of reality that the computer is based off. It's called pixels. And those pixels are based off hardware. And the hardware, I mean, I can go all the way down to electrons. Which one's true? Well, they're all kind of true, but to say one's not true and one is true, and one is not the most fundamental, that does work. The same way if I speak to you and I speak to you on the level of your neurons or your hormones, we're not going to have a great conversation. I have to act with you in the way you're projecting yourself to me. I can't act with you as you truly are in your essence. I can't do that. That's not what I've got access to. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah, and that's the world that we're all building off. The commitment to the authenticity of the Torah is the foundation that everyone within this conversation is working with. So that's a way of using a similar sort of metaphor to talk about God.
Let me ask something which you sort of answered before, but I want to get a little bit closer to an approach over here. If someone is going to accept or live with, perhaps is a better way to phrase it, a rationalist approach to God, because the world I live in reflects that. My experience reflects that. Where is there room, therefore, for experience of God? In other words, if I'm going to say that hashgacha pratit is something which happens under the surface and not in a way which I can see, because scientific causality continues to exist in the way that scientists understand it, and even though I'm a religious Jew coming from a rationalist tradition, I'm going to say that Hashem works within that kind of regular causality, historical or scientific. So how do I have the experience of God? How do I say, God was here? Zek Heli Van Vehu. I see God now, I can point to him, which is something that the mystics will be very happy to do, and rationalists might be more reluctant to do.
That's a great question. And I feel bad always going back to this. It's often a question of personality. But what language can a person who takes this approach use? Two things. First of all, religious experiences don't only have to be that the hashgacha pratis of you getting the parking place. The religious experience takes place intellectually. It takes place emotionally with your family and your children. It's a knowledge and a commitment that God is there. Meaning, God isn't necessarily I'll give you a good metaphor just to move from the sublime to I forgot how the phrase goes. Have you ever read Harry Potter?
I personally have not, but I'm familiar with it. How's that?
I'm sure your audience has.
Yes.
There is a certain mirror in Harry Potter where when you stand in front of the mirror, emerges behind you people that your deepest desires or people you've known and lost, and they appear beside you. Lahavdil, Elef Havdolis. A Jew is asked to walk through the world and see God next to him, not as a person, but as a presence constantly in his life. And the same way, Lahavdil, Harry got a feeling of calm, and people in the story, the myth of the story, people become addicted to it because they want that feeling of presence to be there all the time, and they die watching the mirror. In a similar way, when it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're supposed to feel that presence in your life. Now, does that mean every time something works out well, you say, oh, God did that for me? No, because it probably didn't. But can you be grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Of course you can. Because it wasn't done, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is still the one allowing you to exist. It's still, the Rav Saadia Gaon looks at the foundation of our relationship with God being one of gratitude. He created you. In which case, that is a way of having a religiously vibrant experience in the world without this heavy emphasis on God being involved in every single aspect of your life. And once again, other people will take the other approach. And once again, there's definitely room for both. But the way of approaching the world as God being present in you, I think Rav Hirsch describes this in his Pirush on Tehillim. It's like, where's the response from God to you? It's like the knowledge of his presence.
You know, this reminds me a little bit of something which I read in Rav Shagar Zatzal, and I don't know if you'll agree with this or disagree with this, and I also don't want to cite it incorrectly, so people should read it. It's an essay called Emunati, My Faith, and it's at the very end of the book, Luchot V'Shivrei Luchot. as I remember it, he talked about a particular instance that happened to him where his boiler exploded in his basement, something like that. I don't want to get it exactly because I don't remember. And essentially, he had the immediate sense of something he had done wrong, whether it was giving stuck, I don't remember what it was, that he had to improve in his life. And he said, I'm going to live with two truths at once. Why did my boiler explode? If I say my boiler exploded because God was trying to tell me that I don't give enough tzedakah or whatever it is, that would be absurd. I know why the boiler exploded. It's because there was rust on it and I didn't take care of it. And therefore, at a certain point, scientifically, it was inevitable that it would explode. However, God also speaks to us through these experiences such that the normal scientific things that happen can also contain within them a grain of revelation. The fact that I immediately had this sense in that moment that, I have to give more tzedakah, tells me that alongside and within that same scientifically normative, regular experience is also a revelation of God, which means that two things can coexist at the same time: a naturalist, rationalist world and a hashgacha pratit, God directly involved world, all at the same time. Again, if I'm remembering this correctly, this certainly is the approach that speaks most to me.
But I don't think there's a contradiction there. We can, what do they say, walk and chew gum at the same time. I think that's beautiful. And here's the thing that people, I think, who sort of have drunk too much of this sort of like rationalistic Kool-Aid. The idea that you can explain Rav Chagall's world of his thought, you can explain that from a scientific standpoint as well, doesn't take away from it. Meaning, whether he wants to say that it was actually God putting that in his head or not, but we know our experiences are there to grow from. In which case, what Rav Chagall, from my understanding, did, he uses as an opportunity to grow. That's what a Jew is supposed to do. That is being in relationship with God. Because why does Rav Chagall want to grow? He wants us to grow because he's in a relationship with a source of existence that expects more of him. So when something comes about in his life, and a person can say, well, why didn't your lack of tzedakah come about when you ate breakfast? It's because that's not the sort of thing that brings upon these experiences. He had a religious experience. Now a person pushes back and says, well, is that reflective or is that his neurons? Sorry, why is one not downstream of the other? Why is the epiphany first and the neuron second? Meaning, when people are able to reduce something, they think they've gotten rid of the phenomena. It's like, no, you could look at it from the other standpoint as well. You could look at the phenomena coming first and the physical manifestation of it being downstream of that. There's no way of evidence proving otherwise. So I love that way. I'm definitely on board with that.
Good. As am I. So I'm going to mention an event that's existing right now. We're recording this on Sunday. Yom HaZikaron is in 2 days. Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, is in 3 days. And around this time of year, just finishing up a war, or perhaps in the middle of a war we don't know yet, it obviously makes us think about the position of those who don't go to the army because they say, at least some will say, their learning protects, which is not, I would say, a rationalist approach. Now, perhaps it's unfair to put it together, but when I was thinking about the questions I wanted to ask you, Rav Simi, and thinking about a rationalist approach, which would say, as you have defined it, the world is what the world is, it's real. And a mystical approach, as we're defining it, perhaps a Kabbalistic approach, better said, which would say, again, not to define all Kabbalistic approaches this way, but in this telling, the Torah comes first, the world answers to the Torah, not the other way around. People who are saying, I'm not going to serve in the army because my learning is protecting Klal Yisrael as much or more than any soldier could ever do. Do you think that thinking, which is very controversial now because it's so in our faces, I have a son in the army, do you think that is a product of that mystical approach, or is it something else?
So it's a great question. And I think whenever we use, and I can't help every time we use the word Kabbalist, mystical, rational, 16 different people in my head yelling at me, what are you talking about? You're defining these terms wrong. With all that said and done.
Me too.
The classic approach of understanding Bitachon, this is the way, as I said, it's taught in yeshivas, is classically based off the work, at least in the yeshivish world, of Rav Dessler. Rav Dessler is probably the most famous articulator of this idea that, in essence, Hishtadlus is an illusion. There is no meaning behind the word you're doing directly, the action you're doing directly. It's all in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hands. The question is, do you see that or not? In which case, Hishtadlus is actually just, at best, being Yotzer, the Knas of the original sin. This goes back to the Mesilas Yesharim. It even goes back to Rabbeinu Bachai on some level. But this idea of looking at Bitachon as being informative of what God does in the world, that plays itself out in getting a job. When a person really lives this, then they wouldn't get a job. I mean, they would be very confused why Rashi sold wine, because Rashi was a great man, and great people shouldn't have to act in the world with common hishtadlus if everything really is ordained by the Almighty. In which case they come up with reasons why Rashi did it, perhaps to hide the miracle. Now, if you talk about this enough, it obviously will affect the way you look at the army. If you look at, as I said, is it possible to do both? Look at the world through this lens and still feel a profound responsibility to go to the army? I'm sure it is. But to say one thing doesn't influence the other is also a little bit silly. So it's one of those things that if I don't really, getting a job is an expression of a lack of a person's emunah, ideally they should be learning, then obviously going to the army is also an expression of a lack of emunah. Because, well, why would you have to go to the army if you just trusted enough or did God's will enough? Why would you have to get up and do anything else? I'm learning Torah. And they would bring sources from the Gemara, and then the other people would bring sources countered that. But in terms of a basic framework that can influence how you look at the world, if on the same level that when it comes to getting a job as being in some way a lack of emunah, and the ideal being having faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu providing for you, well then obviously when it comes to something scary and dangerous, if I'm doing the basic necessity, which is learning Torah and engaging in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world, how could I do anything else? Now, obviously there are people who take this approach who go to the army, but I'm saying this approach, which is I suppose within the language we're using, less connected to my experience, because in my experience, and obviously they have ways of making sense of this, in my experience, causation is very real and responsibility is very real. Within that framework, yeah, it moves you away from responsibility in some way. And that's a downside of that worldview, for sure.
I'd like to add another downside, which it might sound cruel to say this, but I'm going to be very upfront about it. And I'll add before saying this, in my own personal hashkafat olam, I am very much drawn towards mystical approaches, Kabbalistic approaches, literal Kabbalistic approaches, even if it doesn't affect my understanding of the world operates olam kimin hago noheg, the world operates in a normal, scientific, rational way. I also believe, as I said, citing Rav Shagar, that can coexist with mystical approaches. Okay, that said, disclaimer aside, basically, the way you're describing the mystical approach in terms of the day-to-day actions of people, it essentially sounds to me like a type of, conspiracy, like a conspiracy theory, because it can't be falsified. The rationalist approach, as you say, accords with the way that the world works according to the way that we all see. In a mystical approach, unlike a more rationalist approach, any evidence can be used in any direction you want. If Rashi is selling wine, that is because he's trying to hide the reality that exists behind the scenes. If chas v'shalom, a soldier dies on the battlefield, even though supposedly learning is protecting him, then either we're not learning enough or something else that can be explained in that way. Now, it doesn't mean that because something can't be falsified, it's inherently not true. I always say, sort of as a joke, that everyone's allowed to believe in one conspiracy theory. It's possible that a conspiracy theory is actually true every once in a while, but in general, it's almost a strike against it because it doesn't really have any intellectual backing. Any evidence can be used in any direction.
So it was one of the things, in the tragic sense of the word, when we experienced the tragedy of October 7th, people tried to use that in the using this framework against people who took this approach. Like, look, if your learning was protected, what happened? Look what happened. And when I heard that, I was like, that is the silliest argument, because what's the clear response? If we hadn't been learning, how much more tragic it would have been. So once again, the evidence fits the framework. The evidence fits the framework. That doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, I'm not omniscient once again. But yeah, that is one of the difficulties socially about this worldview, for sure. Just another one that you just said a personal struggle there. I'll tell you my personal struggle in this context is when I have a brother who's in the Air Force, and people are like, your brother's a pilot? No, he's not that cool. He's a technician, and he fixes the F-16s. And during the
still pretty cool.
Yeah, no, he's an awesome guy. So he's married. He's got he's living in the Gush in Karmei Tzur. He's got a family.
My daughter's in Karmei Tzur. Cool. And her husband and my grandson.
Yeah, that's wonderful. They're loving it. They just moved there. So he's living there with his family, and he works in the army, and he goes there during the war. He was there like every single day for stupid hours. And now when things are calmed down, he's still there 3 days a week, working like an absolute like crazy amount of work. Now, why is this a personal struggle for me? Because during the 12-day war, for some reason, not this time, but during the 12-day war, there were the rounds of the miracles that were happening in the war, and posts were going and speeches were made about how that the statistics, none of this made sense. The machines didn't require fixing, and the technicians were surprised they didn't have to do anything, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was protecting us, and people were posting this around. And I think this is when people sent it to me, I was like, this is just a lie. It is the worst type of lie, because it's the lie on the back of people's hard work. Because my brother and his team worked like absolute animals to get those planes in the air. And yes, some planes couldn't take off and had to be fixed. But it was so inspirational for people who weren't fighting, who weren't on the tarmac, to use God as a token of inspiration on the back of other people suffering. And they needed God, and this maybe connects to our point. They weren't able to. The critique I gave on the moral level is clear, but on the philosophical level, I said you can't step back and see HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hand in history. Look at history and say HaKadosh Baruch Hu is clearly in our lives and taking. You need God to be a mechanic. You need God to come down to the level of the material for you to be inspired. And I think that's a downstream of this view, you can sometimes have that problem.
Oh, that's fantastic. It reminds me of something which I've said before. So for those who are listening, you've heard this before. I apologize. You can skip ahead about 30 seconds. Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense under both Kennedy and Johnson during the Vietnam War, he wrote a memoir. And in his memoir, he talks about the Six-Day War. And he says that before the Six-Day War, they had a situation room assessment of who was going to win. And the answer was, before the Six-Day War, in contrast to what most people would say, oh, the Arabs are going to destroy Israel. He said, no. He said, Israel is going to win. It's going to be a rout. He said, I don't remember what the numbers were. I'm saying, he said, some people said it was going to be 12 days. Some people said it was going to be this. Israel was going to win. Now, first of all, let's acknowledge that it's possible that he is now retroactively remembering something that didn't happen exactly like that. So that's also possible. However, let's assume his memory is accurate. To me, that does not lessen the miracle. It's exactly what you're saying. As opposed to thinking that God was actually a fighter pilot who went and destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, it's saying, wait a minute, you're telling me that a country which is 19 years old, which has a tiny population fighting the entire Arab world, 22 years after the Shoah, is going to beat them in a rout? And kachaya, that's what happened? That doesn't make it less miraculous. Maybe it makes it more miraculous.
Yeah, no, for sure, 100%. And so as I said, I think they have their psychological and philosophical problems, and for sure. And I think you live in a richer, more real world when you're able to look at the world through that lens.
Before we end, I asked Simi a more personal question. Not just how he thinks about emunah, but whether his own faith was ever actually tested. He describes a period where, internally, he found the arguments for atheism more compelling than the arguments he heard for belief, even while he was still fully observant. And he explained what pulled him back and how he built the approach to Judaism that he lives by today. That part of the conversation is available exclusively to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. The link is in the description of this podcast. Rabbi Simi, let's conclude. And I could keep talking to you for hours about this, and maybe I'll have you back on to continue the conversation. There's so much to say, and I just really, really relate to what you're talking about. If you were building a curriculum, or perhaps let's go a little easier than that. Curriculum is a big word, but just an approach in general to teaching emunah in high school, in seminaries, in yeshivot, anywhere. Obviously, it depends on the person, but if you're giving a general approach, because I'm not talking about talking to this person versus that person, where you've already said it depends on the person, but by and large, how would you do it differently? How would you do it differently than the way is most commonly done now, where there is a strong emphasis on the mystical approach, Kabbalistic approach, etc., disclaimers aside, and almost a disincentive to teaching a rationalist approach?
So it's a great question. And to a certain extent, I kind of do that in Midrashet Rachel and Chappelle's, where I'm blessed to be able to teach. And I have a Chabur in Chappelle's, and I have a series of classes in Midrashet Rachel, two profoundly phenomenal institutions on so many levels. And I could talk about that for a long time. Both me and Rivka both teach there.
And as a graduate, I can attest that it is a fantastic institution.
But before I was the first person to give an actual philosophy class in Chappelle's in this way. And so when I'm giving a curriculum, specifically in Midrashet Rachel, which is structured like a curriculum, the way to do it is really be broad and try and explain to people the different approaches. Now, obviously, when it's more controversial, be explicit, it's more controversial. For example, when I taught the Ralbag to one of the students, they were shocked, and they said it to another teacher, and the other teacher said, impossible. It cannot be true. So what was I supposed to say there? Fight the other teacher? I was like, no, but I made, when I was speaking to the Anhala, I said, I made it clear to the student. The reason I'm telling you this is to let you know that there is a broad perspective, even though that is a marginal view. Nobody adopts that view in their daily life today, but it's important to know these views exist for two reasons. One, because you're learning Torah, and it's still considered Kiyum HaTorah. It's still considered Hashkafik Machshavet Yisrael, but also from the fact that you become broad about what Judaism is and what Judaism does and how Jewish thinkers have thought and the freedom they thought they had in terms of this thinking, to be able to see that when you find an approach, when you look at a different approach, and you don't later on come along and say, why did nobody tell me this? And at the same time, you teach the approach to the best. You explain to the best that the leaf that is falling, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's absolute undying love for you in an intimate way, where God is with you constantly. He's crying with you during your struggle. And you explain both. And a person says, well, if you explain both and you're wishy-washy, no, you can always at the end of the talk say, and just to let you know, on a personal level, I find this worldview more attractive. I find this worldview more spiritually meaningful. You can be honest about your own experience as well. This idea that perhaps a difference between a philosophy lecturer and a class in Jewish philosophy in a yeshiva or in a seminary. In a yeshiva or in a seminary, my personal experience is part of the conversation. A student will call me up and ask me, okay, how do I approach this? Can you help me tease this apart? Because I'm not just a lecturer. I would never want to be just a lecturer. That barrier that a lecturer has to his students, because it's supposed to be teaching ideas. I don't care about your personal experience. No, your personal experience comes to play, because if a student puts their hand up and says, why do you find that attractive? I can explain. And then a student can say, well, I find that difficult because, and I say, well, that's great. And your approach is slightly different, and that's okay. And it becomes more of a discussion as well. So I think when it comes to a curriculum, I think openness to other worldviews, other approaches, and I think always come back to the idea that the foundation of this whole conversation is emunah, a clear definition of what we mean by emunah from the point of view of the word, but also from the terms of its the definition in terms of its actual content, being a process, a state of being rather than a having.
That really speaks to me very much. If I could add just one small point, I think that, again, perhaps this is expressing my own mystical viewpoint. If we try to consider what truth is from the perspective of heaven, as opposed to from an earthly perspective, down here, we can't encompass a truth that transcends all physical reality, all finite limitations. Heavenly reality, heavenly truth is such a truth. And therefore, on earth, and this echoes Rabbi Sachs in certain ways, on earth, truth can only be a fragment of that which appears as the ultimate truth above. And while we can't say that every single approach has validity, I'm not going to go that far. I don't think that's true. And in fact, that makes a mockery of what truth is. If we're talking about whether it's the Ralbag's approach or the Rambam's approach or the Best's approach or anyone else's approach, it could be that on some higher level, they all emerge together into a bigger truth, and each person is grasping at a particular aspect of that truth down here, which is fragmented in our fragmented world, but somehow can be put together on a higher level.
So I love that. And I think it's the Chidah that says the idea of Elu is like an object which different people are looking from different angles. And truth to each one of them exists, even though we have to like live it one way. But also there's some beautiful midrashim about how Kadosh Baruch Hu throwing truth down to the earth for it to grow up. They all fit in line with this without, and it's key and important to point out, without us becoming relativists. We're not saying there is no truth, there is no direction of pursuit, but it's not something that you can hold and shake.
Very good. Simi, it is always a pleasure talking to you and learning from you, and I really appreciate the approach that you outlined today. Rabbi Simi Lerner, thank you.
My absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me.
I'd like to offer a word of thanks to our Patreon supporters. Patreon functions as a voluntary tip jar for Jewish Coffee House and our family of podcasts. Patreon supporters at all levels, as well as paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, will have access to our upcoming private Q&A sessions. Your support in either place helps sustain thoughtful Jewish conversation. Additional bonus material, including the longer episodes with bonus questions, is available to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. No matter how you choose to support this work, we are deeply grateful. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com.